G'day and welcome back to Reality Check. So this week, we've got a good friend of mine and a good friend of the show, Daniel Otis, who's an investigative journalist based in Toronto, Canada, who contributes to CTV News, one of Canada's equivalents, if you like, of CNN. Daniel's been covering UFOs for many, many years, and he's probably one of Canada's foremost journalists investigating the subject. And the reason I want to pull him in today is because of the so-called Sky Canada report. Back in 2022, I think, Canada announced, to everyone's surprise, that it was going to investigate UFOs, UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena. And the report came down in June this year. Dan, I'm really keen to hear from you, sir. Do you think the report said anything substantial? What's significant? Or was it a fizzer?
Well, I think there were some people hoping that the report would look into cases and the larger questions around UAP. It didn't do that. It set out, its goals were to look at how UAP reports are collected officially in Canada and to offer recommendations for improvements if needed. Well, they certainly found some recommendations for improvement. And basically, what this report is saying is that, UAP data collection needs to be standardized in Canada, and that there should be a federal body tasked with investigating these sorts of cases. Right now, there's a sort of patchwork of procedures that captures UFO reports through transportation officials, military, Air Force, what have you. But, generally speaking, unless there's a clear national security, defense, or safety nexus, there tends to be no follow-up. What the Sky Canada project is saying is that, reports of this nature are worthy of further scientific study, and that the only way we're going to be able to find answers and get explanations is if we have better data sets, which could happen through, the standardization of reporting mechanisms and proper scientific analysis.
Now, this is very significant. This is the Chief Science Advisor of Canada for the Canadian government acknowledging that unidentified anomalous phenomena needs to be investigated and data collected on it. That in and of itself is very significant, isn't it?
Well, I'd say so. The Chief Science Advisor of Canada reports directly to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet. It's an arm's length advisory office that, takes on projects on its own initiative. I mean, in the past, it's looked at COVID-19. It's looked at aquaculture. It's looked at questions of open science. And, I guess seeing the news that was coming out of the United States, members of this office their interest was certainly developed out of that, and they decided to dive headlong into it.
Were you consulted? Were you one of the people that was consulted as part of their investigations?
Yeah, absolutely. The final report that was released this summer included a paragraph on my contributions to the field. My journalistic work on this has unveiled procedural material, cases, shown how, UAP reports continue to come in from particularly credible observers like pilots and police officers, and how, there are documents that I've been able to, pull through the Freedom of Information system showing, how these things are cataloged. I was consulted. My work was cited in the report. I've spoken to members of the team at the Sky Canada project. And they also spoke to other folks. I mean, they spoke to Aero. They spoke to the Gaipan UFO group in France. They spoke to a lot of folks and put out a pretty interesting report.
Why have they done this? I mean, it would have been so easy for them to do what, for example, the Australian government continues to do, which is to stick its head in the sand and deny that there's an issue at all. Basically say, look, we're not interested in UFOs. We don't recognise there's any need to investigate them. We've got other priorities. Why, at a time when I know your respective governments and time have basically been criticised for spending too much money on follies, why are they spending money on investigating UAPs?
Well, I think they saw the developments happening south of the border, the ongoing Pentagon efforts to look into the UAP issue, NASA, some of the academic endeavors we're seeing out of the United States. And I think it demonstrated to them that, they're clearly is interest here, that, reports of this nature do continue to come in, that we don't have explanations, and that anything, sort of unknown or unexplained should be looked at through a scientific lens. I think it's very important to note, as I did before, that this is an arm's length scientific advisory office. I mean, had they, not been an arm's length office, who knows if they would have been given the liberty to pursue a topic of this nature. But they did so rather boldly at a time when, there isn't a lot of political capital in discussing this issue. We can talk about putting money into things like this when we have so many other economic problems in our world. But I think it really demonstrated a lot of courage and forward thinking and willingness to tackle this issue seriously.
I agree with you there. I mean, to me, it's quite extraordinary that they've decided to recommend the creation, if you like, of a federal body that would be responsible for collating and investigating UAPs. Has there been any progress from the Canadian government on just how they're going to create such a body and who's going to do it?
It's hard to say. The Sky Canada project report specifically singles out the Canadian Space Agency as being, a trusted scientific body that could undertake this effort. In my communications with the Canadian Space Agency, at least their communications team, the way they paint it, they don't really want to get involved with the issue. We did, however, get a pretty supportive response from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is our federal police force here in Canada. They expressed willingness into supporting this project and cooperating with the Sky Canada project, because it's, in most of Canada, the RCMP, the federal police, are going to be your first point of contact if you want to report something unusual in the sky. They get a lot of reports like this, and they would love for there to be a scientific body that could look at them to free them up to do their, policing work.
So the police have actually said that to you, have they? The Mounties want some kind of investigative agency.
The Mounties have come forward and supporting this issue. And if you look, even in the historical record, the Mounties have been receiving reports of this nature from concerned Canadian citizens for decades upon decades upon decades.
So let's just go back a bit, because one of the things about Canada that intrigues me is for a while there you had a member of parliament, I think his name was Larry Maguire, and he raised interesting concerns in a letter that was directed, I think, to the Defence Minister of Canada, suggesting that there had been historical Canadian military collaboration with the US on UAP crash retrievals. They were very broad inquiries that he made to the Canadian Defence Minister, but essentially a denial came back from the Minister's office that the DRDC, the Defence Research and Development Canada organisation, was doing any current work on UAP. And I have a hunch that that response from the Canadian Defence Minister was a little evasive, that essentially they confined their answer not to a broad denial of any Canadian government scientific investigation and collaboration with the US, but that they constrained their answer back to MP Larry Maguire at the time to the DRDC, to this Defence Research and Development Canada organisation. Did the Sky Canada inquiry at any stage investigate any of the allegations made by Larry Maguire? And what do you know about these claims that were made by Larry Maguire? He seemed to have inside information.
Yeah, well, I guess to start with the Sky Canada project. I mean, the report they released does not touch upon this issue. As I stated before, their real mission was just to look at the current state of procedures and to, offer improvements. They didn't look at these types of allegations, although I'm sure members of the team have looked into this issue. It fell outside of the scope of their report. I mean, with the right political support and the right political will, the report that we see could perhaps be chapter one in an ongoing effort. But, we'll need a little bit of political buy-in to make that happen. As for this letter from Mr. Maguire, Larry Maguire is a member, or was a member of Parliament from southern Manitoba and the Canadian prairies. He didn't stand for re-election in the election we had this year, so he's just retired after a long career in public office. He's probably one of the most significant Canadian politicians when it comes to this issue, insofar as his advocacy. I mean, he was advocating for the Sky Canada projects before it was even officially launched. And yes, in his letter to the former defense minister, he asked about, alleged Canadian nexus in crash retrievals and reverse engineering in that matter. The response that came from the Department of Defense, was evasive. As far as I'm aware, Maguire was basing his questions off material that was presented to them by a source. As for corroborating evidence, it's certainly been a hole I've tried diving into, but it's nonstop dead ends. The day I have a document in hand or a witness willing to go on the record about, Canadian nexus and these sorts of allegations, I will certainly run with the story. But, it's been a couple of years of hard digging without finding that conclusive answer.
So as I understand it, there were meetings between Larry Maguire's office and a whistleblower source from inside the scientific establishment in the Canadian military. Was that the allegation you heard?
That's my understanding. I don't think Mr. Maguire pulled these allegations out of thin air. The way it was presented to me by his office is that they were speaking to an individual that they deemed credible who was making allegations of this nature about Canada's historical involvement, perhaps during the Cold War era. But again, this person hasn't wanted to come forward in a public way, as far as I know. And if they're out there listening, they should give you or me a call and come on the show, because I'd love to hear from them.
I mean, I've heard a whole lot of rumours, and it's speculation only. I mean, I've heard from people in the program, so-called, which is essentially the secret, covert US program that everybody denies exists, which is essentially retrieving and attempting to reverse engineer technology. And there is one source, and I would never use that source because I have to protect them, but they've told me that there has been, and the word is has been, collaboration between Canadian military scientists and American scientists on certain technology. It was even suggested to me that there might be technology which is located in Canada. Have you heard similar allegations?
I've certainly heard things of a similar nature. I pull every thread that presents itself to me, but I have nothing conclusive to say on that one. I hope I can come back and tell you more about that.
Just for our audience to understand, Daniel and I are both journalists who are trained to read press releases backwards. We're trained to read between the lines. And in the answer that came from the former Canadian Defence Minister when she was the Canadian Defence Minister to the question posed by Larry Maguire, it was very interesting that Larry had phrased his question specifically about Defence Department involvement with the American military on crash tech, i.e. UAP technology, non-human technology. And what's interesting was that the minister confined her answer very specifically to this DRDC organisation. And I think that was perhaps a fault with Larry, that he was a bit too sure of himself and he focused his inquiry on the DRDC specifically, which gave the minister an opportunity to specifically deny DRDC involvement. It raises the possibility, I think, likelihood that there have historically been Canadian scientists that are perhaps not part of that so-called DRDC who have and were involved in collaboration with US scientists on alleged retrieved non-human technology.
Well, the DRDC, as it exists now, would be if there was any sort of scientific analysis happening within the Canadian military, that would be the obvious place where you would find that kind of work happening. Interesting. You say that's former Defense Minister Anita Anand, who now is our foreign minister. So who's dealing directly with the Trump administration as well as other governments. So this is a very prominent individual. I really wish I had more I could share or tell you on this, but for me, it's been, I guess it's very similar to what you're hearing, but it's been difficult to find any kind of corroborating evidence on this one. It's not something I've given up on, though.
No, absolutely. I'm with you. I want to get to the bottom of it. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Daniel, was there was a memo. I'm not sure if it was you that obtained it, but there was an FOI memo that was provided to the Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Trudeau, which briefed that, quote, full exploitation of the Alaska object was still ongoing. And a later statement from Canadian military clarified that the memo was stating that the object had not yet been found, which is not actually what the memo says. They referred to it as Object Number 23. Object 23's function, method of propulsion, or affiliation to any nation-state remains unverified. It is unknown whether it poses an armed threat or has intelligence collection capabilities. The full exploitation of UAP 20, which was engaged by the US on February the 10th, 2023, has not yet been completed. And just to make things clear, UAP 23 is the one that was tracked over Yukon entering Canadian airspace. And this is some of the, I think, 4 mystery objects that flew across the United States, only one of which has formally been confirmed as an alleged Chinese government balloon. One of these objects, of course, fell in the Yukon. I thought it was interesting, that memo. What's your takeaway from that memo? Do we assume that there's something to this? What did they mean about full exploitation of the Alaska object? Did you ever get to the bottom of that?
Oh, it's hard to say. If you look at the date of the memo, that was a story that I broke for CTV News, revealing this memo. If I recall correctly, I think it was provided by a reader who was doing their own freedom of information work, if I recall correctly. As for the full exploitation, yeah, certainly the word full exploitation implies that, they're actively in the midst of exploiting or analyzing something. What strikes me about these cases, we had the object that was shot down Alaska, Canada's Yukon territory, which borders Alaska, and then one over Lake Huron in the Great Lakes. No information came out. We heard a lot about, this Chinese spy balloon, which we had clear as day photos. But in terms of the other objects, we were given nothing. My work has found some more details. For example, the work I did found images that were taken of the Yukon object. Emails about those images revealed that they were stills from video. I tried to obtain that video and was denied, but we at least got the images. Other freedom of information work has revealed that the RCMP, the Mounties, recovered debris from the shores of Lake Huron. That information was never made public for whatever reason. As for the Alaska object, it's even less has come through. And, the debris that was collected from Lake Huron, according to the internal analysis and the documents I was able to find, made it pretty clear that it was perhaps some sort of smaller weather balloon type device. Okay. But why all the secrecy? And if our militaries and governments are willing to be so intensely secret about something that has a pretty ordinary explanation, I mean, what are they willing to lie and mislead about?
Well, because the reason I really wanted you to make that point is because the findings in this quite, I think, excellent report from Sky Canada are that in order to avoid conspiracy theories, in order to diffuse public speculation that there's something sinister going on with these objects, it's very important to be transparent. And what shocks me is that we are now, 2-3 years on now from those February 2023 overflights that became a massive media issue in not only Canada, but the United States and the rest of the world. It was a huge concern that there'd been these overflights of the continental United States, North America. And we still don't have answers to that mystery. Isn't that in and of itself a spit in the eye to the claims that are made in the Sky Canada report about the importance of transparency and accountability?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, the lack of transparency certainly has fueled all kinds of theories about these objects, and if my reporting sheds light on perhaps, how ordinary, at least, one of these things was, why all the secrecy? Is it a case of, they're embarrassed for overreacting? Possible. Is it a case of them wanting to cover something up? Yes, also possible. It's frustrating. I find it, not only as a journalist, but as a citizen of Canada, that we had these incidents that dominated headlines and generated a great deal of public curiosity. And, our government and military officials don't have the fundamental respect for the populace to provide them with the answers that they do have when they do have them. It's
interesting because in the Sky Canada report, they actually specifically address, I noticed, the overflying 4 objects, and they acknowledge that one of them was, of course, shot down over the US territorial waters off the coast of South Carolina, and it was identified as originating from a foreign country and carried sophisticated equipment. I think that's the Canadians not wanting to offend China. But it also acknowledged that 1 week later, on February the 11th, 2023, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, ordered the downing of a smaller balloon over Yukon territory, Canadian territory. 2 other small high-altitude balloons, it says, was shot down over US airspace, one in northern Alaska, February the 10th, and the second over Lake Huron on February the 12th. And apparently there was a brief statement by an RCMP, a Mountie spokesperson, to CTV News. The recovered debris from the shores of Lake Huron were deemed not to be of national security concern. If it really is the case that these were, as they say, high-altitude balloons, small high-altitude balloons, why the secrecy?
As I said, I mean, embarrassment for using a very expensive missile to down something, that cost a few $100 perhaps. The desire to cover up something. The secrecy to me seems unnecessary. I mean, I'm a proponent for radical transparency from our governments. That's part of what drew me as a journalist into looking at the UFO UAP issue. I mean, I write about all kinds of things. I do investigations on other subjects too. But this one, it was just so striking to me that we have this history of governments essentially not respecting the public's ability to digest this kind of information. Decades of obfuscation, decades of denials. So to me, this sort of seemed like a continuation of that. Now the Sky Canada project is coming out and saying we need to end this kind of secrecy in order to regain public trust. And when it comes specifically, the UFO issue shows you how public trust can be in government can be eroded. It's clear as day that folks are seeing things they can't explain. Yet it's only just in the past few years, after decades, that we're finally getting, some degree of support from governments publicly saying that, this is a real issue worth looking into.
Now, just returning for a moment to the speculation that was made by Larry Maguire MP when he was an MP to the Canadian Defence Minister that there might be Canadian scientists who had historically involved themselves in collaborating with the US on retrieved non-human alien technology. Incredible allegation. What's fascinating to me is that there is an on-the-record public history in Canada involving a gentleman called Wilbert Smith, who was an engineer with the Department of Transport in Canada in the 1950s. And he asked for permission to do part-time research to investigate whether some UFOs could use the power of Earth's magnetic field as a source of propulsion. They talk about Project Magnet in the Sky Canada report and how Smith essentially expanded its investigative scope to include investigations into the validity of UFO observations. What's interesting is they represent that Smith's work was private work, and yet it's quite clear from what Wilbert Smith said during his lifetime that he was liaising very closely with very senior people in what seems to have been some kind of precursor of what we now know of as the legacy UAP crash retrieval reverse engineering program. He said he was briefed about the secret UAP program by people, scientists in the United States, that the contacts that he made were facilitated by, I think, the Canadian consulate or the Canadian embassy in Washington, D.C., and that he was told that this was a secret that was higher even than the hydrogen bomb. What do you know about the Wilbert Smith story? Was he just an eccentric Canadian engineer who did these investigations on his own bat, or do you think that there was some kind of collaboration going on between Wilbert Smith and scientists or officials in the US military?
I think probably a little bit of both, is my sense of it. He started looking into this in an official capacity. And once the powers that be got a whiff of what he was up to, his official investigations were ended, but that didn't stop him from continuing to dig.
And good on him for doing so.
Absolutely. I mean, like, it appears he did make contacts, in the United States. I'll be frank with you. I'll be honest. My research has mostly focused on contemporary cases and procedures. I work as a journalist, and if you find documents from 70 years ago, most news editors aren't going to get excited about that. They want to see the Royal Canadian Air Force procedures that are on the books today in 2025. So I'm not an expert on Wilbert Smith, but it is, as far as we can tell, the earliest official Canadian investigatory effort into the issue. He took it very seriously. He claims to have been told information that, is echoed in that letter Larry Maguire wrote to the former defense minister. There's, to me, it seems there's threads to pull there, and there's still threads to pull there. The Wilbert Smith papers create a lot of questions that we still don't have conclusive answers for.
Let's talk about some of those contemporary cases that you're aware of. One of the people I think we should probably tip our hat to on the way through here is it Chris Rutkowski? Chris Rutkowski. He's run a civilian organisation for many years inside Canada, which essentially had been, I think, even the referring point by police and other government agencies. You actually had an extraordinary situation where a private UFO data gathering organization led by Mr. Rutkowski was essentially gathering all of the data on UAPs in that part of North America. What do you know about some of the more recent contemporary UAP reports, and have they played any part in prompting the Canadian government to start taking this issue more seriously?
Yeah, well, just to backtrack a little bit about Chris Rutkowski. He's a researcher out of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and he's done some interesting work. His group has been collecting and collating Canadian reports for decades, and for a period of almost 20 years, he was receiving some reports directly from Canadian transportation and military officials, which he was using in his survey that he publishes every year. In terms of contemporary reports, my research shows that in very, very recent years, we have pilots on airlines like United, American Airlines, Air Canada, WestJet, Air France, KLM. I could go on and on, reporting unusual lights and objects over Canadian skies. My research has uncovered air traffic control audio where you can hear pilots describing these kinds of lights in real time and their, sense of awe and wonder. I think there's a few specific cases. When you ask the Canadian government, what do you do about UFO reports? The line you get back generally says, we do not, investigate or follow up unless there is a safety, or security issue. And there have been cases where there has been a safety and security issue and they did follow up. For example, there was a case I found, I'm trying to remember the year. It's from the 2000s where it involved an American Airlines flight seeing an unusual light off the Atlantic coast of Canada. Two other flights also see the same light. The Canadian Air Force scrambles CF-18 fighter jets to investigate. They don't see anything. They return home. There's other cases where NORAD radar detects a fast-moving object coming in from over the Arctic. Fighter jets are scrambled. Again, oftentimes the reports show they don't see anything. There was another one right here in Toronto where a Porter Airlines flight approaching the downtown Toronto Island airport coming in from Ottawa. It's cruising in over Lake Ontario, and suddenly there is a donut-shaped object in its path right in front of it. The plane takes a bit of a nosedive, evasive action to avoid hitting this object. And because the flight attendants weren't wearing their seatbelts at the time, they were thrown into the cabin structure and they ended up getting sent to the hospital. And the workplace injuries created a safety investigation. And there's literally hundreds of pages of documents and emails of them trying to get to the bottom of this case. I believe that one was 2016. So there are cases that,
Did they get to the bottom of that one? I mean, that one sounds intriguing. What was the finding of the cause of the actual accident? They ultimately determined, the official line that they ended up telling me and other members of the media, it was that the description of the object did not match any known commercially available drone. The internal emails I reviewed showed some degree of speculation that perhaps it was an experimental drone that drifted from a military base in upstate New York. They were floating around images of a sort of donut-filled object that would have been filled with helium with a rotor in it. They said that kind of looked like it. I've actually, in this case, I wrote about it, and afterwards the pilot reached out to me to discuss it. And he said there was, I'm not going to go into details. It was an off-the-record conversation, but I can tell you that he was never given a conclusive answer about what he saw. They were thought maybe it could have been, some kind of military drone, but it was all maybes. There was no conclusive answer. They decided to end the investigation without determining what it was. The flight attendants only had minor injuries. They were released from hospital, and that was the end of it. The thing that really shocks me all the time about both the way the US, Canada, and indeed Australia handle these reports is they often say there is no issue of national security posed by these UAP events. But it's becoming more and more implausible, that assertion. It's certainly not only a national security incident that something is breaching airspace without being identified. It's a flight safety issue as well. I mean, by any measure, what you're describing there is an acute flight safety issue. People were injured because of an unknown object in the sky that they had to avoid.
A huge flight safety issue. Absolutely. National security. I see that. I always, I've said this before. I worry about the national security lens. I was really happy about the Sky Canada project because of its scientific focus. When I talk to journalists in the United States who research this issue, they have a really hard time accessing data. When your national organizations, your defense officials are looking at this seriously as a defense issue, suddenly everything can be withheld through freedom of information. I've had a great deal of success pulling reports and cases in Canada precisely because it hasn't been viewed as a national security issue here. Had our military officials operated under that lens, I probably would have only have received a fraction of the data I have thus far. The journalists I talk to in the United States, they can get officials to talk to them about UAPs much easier than we can in Canada. But the data, it becomes so scarce. But the incidents, the shoot down incidents, show, there's a national security nexus. I'm very pleased and supportive of the angle that the Sky Canada project took, specifically that there is a scientific issue here that needs answering.
But is anything going to happen, Daniel? I mean, by the sounds of it, it's now stuck in the bureaucracy. You've said that the Space Agency of Canada doesn't want it on their desk. The Mounties are obviously keen for it to happen. Is there any political impetus, or is it just going to sit on a shelf and gather dust in the office of the chief scientist?
Well, that's the real issue here. With Larry Maguire retiring from politics, we no longer have a political public-facing champion like that in Canada. We don't have anyone in Parliament. I mean, you look at the U.S., you have multiple members of Senate and Congress who are willing to keep hammering this issue. In Canada, with Maguire's retiring, we don't have anyone, I guess, willing to do so publicly. I've had conversations that certainly show that there are members of Parliament who are interested in the issue, but we don't seem to have anyone quite as willing as Mr. Larry Maguire, quite as willing to stick their neck out and become a champion of the cause. And I think without that kind of political support, I'm afraid this could be dead in the water. We have a brand new government in Canada. They're hyper fixated on a lot of the economic challenges posed by the Trump administration and its dealings with Canada. And for them to invest time and money into something of this nature does not seem very probable at this point in time.
It's interesting.
But, I'd love to be proven wrong.
It's interesting that you speculated that the donut-shaped object that the plane tried to avoid might have come from an upstate New York US military base. Because, of course, the other thing that's been going on in this period is I think they started around October, November last year, the overflights of parts of continental North America by what the government of the United States has euphemistically deemed drones. I don't know if that's an appropriate term, but were the drone sightings, I've had messages from people in Canada, notably in Toronto, who've sent me videos and photographs of weird looking objects that frankly look like aircraft, but are moving so pathetically slowly. In some cases, they're stationary. They're not. Have you had the same drone so-called alerts in your part of North America?
I don't think we've had the kind of mass sightings that we were seeing on the Northeast in the United States. But yeah, listen, I get multiple emails a week from Canadians seeing things like this, in Toronto, way out in the middle of, in small towns in the middle of nowhere, in big cities. I mean, in the country, in the urban settings, people are seeing things. One other thing I'd like to bring up about that sighting over Lake Ontario is that we also have two significant nuclear power plants just outside of Toronto on the shores of Lake Ontario. I want to bring this, we talk about government transparency. I'm in a multi-year battle now to try and get security reports on UFO sightings from these nuclear power plants released. They have been denying.
They're refusing to release them, are they?
They refuse to release them. This was I think I first filed my request in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. They refused to release them. I filed a complaint. We went through mediation. They continued to refuse to release them. And then in addition to refusing to release them, they hired outside counsel to create a legal justification that stated that they are, a provincial crown corporation. So a provincial governmental corporation runs these nuclear power plants. And what they're trying to argue now is that by following the provincial freedom of information legislation, they would therefore be in violation of their federal nuclear security obligations.
And yet we have this Sky Canada report saying that one of the things that is most essential is for the public to be discouraged from developing conspiracy theories by the government being as open as possible about everything that it knows on the subject of UAPs. It's a total contradiction, isn't it?
But this isn't even just not being transparent. This is putting taxpayer money into fighting transparency. Thankfully, I was able to find a lawyer, Josh DeHaas, with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, who's taking on this case pro bono. And, you know, the Ontario Power Generation, the folks that operate this nuclear power plant were really trying to drown me in legalese. And
it's funny you should mention it, because there is a nexus, isn't there, between nuclear plants, nuclear power facilities, and UAP sightings. Have you had anecdotal reports that have led to you asking for these FOI reports?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure.
So I've people are telling you that there's
I've had people reach out, not folks necessarily willing to go on the record and describe their stories, but I heard enough echoes of this that it prompted me to file these requests. They denied them. I immediately asked if records were, identified. They said yes. And hence now I'm in this multi-year, legal wrangling. We hear that in the United States. We hear that in other countries that, there have been interesting and significant sightings in and around nuclear facilities or nuclear weapon facilities. I very much want to see if that's the case in Canada, but they are fighting me tooth and nail when it comes to getting these reports out.
Why do you think that is, Daniel? I mean, obviously, there's a tendency, I think, for all of us to default to a conspiracy theory that they're trying to hide something. Do you think there's a good reason why they're trying to conceal this information?
I'm a little biased here. I think they don't have no good reason. They don't want to deal with it. Their argument is that releasing these security reports reveal vulnerabilities in their defenses. I've actually toured I've toured one of these nuclear power plants for an unrelated story, and you have guys with assault rifles and high levels of security. But my argument has always been, okay, release the reports, redact everything that could, violate your security or make you folks vulnerable, and provide me with the descriptions of, these objects or lights themselves. But they don't want to do that.
I think it's wonderful that you're getting pro bono legal assistance. Could you just name again the lawyer that's doing this good work on your behalf?
His name is Josh DeHaas with the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Josh is a former journalist, actually. We met as journalists. He left journalism to pursue a law career. And when this fight started heating up, I reached out to him, and he just happened to be working with a legal organization that, takes on cases, in terms of that deal with free speech or transparency and government secrecy.
Well, and good on Josh. Yeah. Good on him for doing that. I also think it's important too that one of the other things that came through to me from the Sky Canada report that I thought was really interesting was that not only do Canadians report somewhere between 600 to 1,000 UAP sightings annually, they did a survey for Sky Canada, and the survey's results are actually quite profound. 1 in 4 respondents said that they had personally witnessed a UAP in their lifetime. A quarter of respondents said they'd seen a UAP, but only 10% reported their sightings, and 40% of respondents wouldn't know whom to report their sightings to anyway. And interestingly, a majority of the respondents supported the idea of creating a federal government service to gather UAP reports and to make those findings publicly available. So you really do have public opinion on your side, Daniel.
Absolutely. And when I saw that was interesting that they hired they commissioned an outside consulting company to do this work. I would be one of those people. Many years ago, I saw some odd moving lights in the sky, and I didn't, I'm like, that's interesting. I didn't think anything of it, didn't report it to anybody. And, you get a group of people together or start asking people questions in a bar, you usually hear similar stories from people. People see things, and they, most people don't want to stick their necks out. And in my case, I saw something weird like that as a kid. It was with my brother. We saw it. Wow. And we both remember it to this day, but, most people just don't report. It's just something that happens, and they scratch their head and go on with their lives. Hopefully, if the Sky Canada recommendations are implemented and we have a new federal body that standardizes and collects these reports, and they engage in the sort of public outreach that the Sky Canada project is recommending, then maybe this will get on people's radar. Oh, I saw something weird. It's in the interest of science that I report this to this body. The only way we can get to truth and answers is with more and better data. And, their recommendations, if implemented, would provide us with more and better data. And I really hope, I hope to see that implemented.
Well, if implemented is the order of the day, I sincerely hope, Daniel Otis, that you do get an implementation of the recommendations of the Office of the Chief Science Advisor from the Sky Canada report of June 2025, because I think it's a very important report. How can people get in touch with you, Daniel, if, for example, a scientist that has collaborated with the United States on secret retrieved alien technology does want to share some information? How do they get in touch with you?
Well, you can find me on Twitter or X, DS Otis. My direct messages are always open. Always happy to move over to more secured communication apps once initial contact has been made. You can find my website, danielotis.ca. Email me, otisstories@gmail.com. Google, I'm on YouTube. I'm there. You can find me. Tell me your stories. I would really like to hear more about those allegations.
And I think for the people out there who might be equivocating about whether their stories are relevant, whether they're useful, please, either Daniel or I, feel free to come forward. We're very, very happy to take your tips and very happy to process them. Daniel Otis, thank you so much for joining Reality Check. I look forward to getting you back on the show when you finally, hopefully, win your FOI case against the Lake Ontario nuclear power plant, and we find out all about the disturbing UAP sightings that plant's so desperately trying to conceal.
Thank you so much for having me. I am not going to give up on that or any of these. As a journalist, you see a thread, you got to pull it. So wherever it leads us, we'll find the truth. Thanks a lot, Ross.
Good on you. G'day and welcome back to Reality Check Q&A, where you get to ask me the hard questions. It's the time of the week I fear the most. There's always some curly question that puts me on the back foot. And here to ask them, my friend and colleague, producer Megan Orada. G'day, Megan. How are you today?
Great, Ross. How are you?
Very well. Very, very well. Fire away. Let's hit me with some of those excoriating questions.
All right, we will start with Rod, who's got some comments about NASA. Dear Ross, recently Dr. Gregory Rogers, a former NASA chief flight surgeon and Air Force major, has given public testimony detailing an event from 1992 where he claims he was shown CCTV footage of a craft he describes as a, quote, flying saucer inside a hangar at Cape Canaveral. Most remarkably, he states the craft bore a U.S. Air Force insignia. However, his story has received surprisingly little in-depth coverage compared to other whistleblowers. My question for your Q&A is, would you consider investigating his claims further and potentially interviewing him?
You're absolutely right. His story is important. I met Dr. Gregory Rogers very briefly at Contact in the Desert in May this year. He's a lovely bloke and I find him very persuasive. I heard him speak and I think the story he tells is very important. And frankly, anyone of his stature. I mean, he was a former chief surgeon or such like for NASA at Cape Canaveral. That's a very senior position. The fact that he's willing to speak out and say what he saw says an enormous amount. And basically, my one issue with what he says is he's not saying he saw directly a craft. He's saying he saw CCTV of a craft, which is the point, a very, very important point, because a lot of people, a lot of debunkers and skeptics have suggested that he was just shown a fake video, or that, how can he be certain that what he saw was real? I'm reasonably confident that there are such craft being operated using US Air Force insignia. And the reason why I believe Dr. Rogers is because of what I've been told by a source who frustratingly won't go on camera, but who did tell me a story about what he saw at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And it was very, very similar. It was a gigantic elliptical craft, massive, apparently 20, 30 meters wide, hovering in a clearing at Eglin Air Force Base. It's clearly being attended to by both uniformed and suited men. And in the moment that he was standing there looking at it, as he was having a covert cigarette hidden away from view, he literally saw the object blink from sight. Literally, he blinked and it disappeared. It was that fast. It disappeared. There was a momentary shudder of the trees, presumably by the displacement of air underneath the object. But whatever it was some kind of craft using a propulsion system that we know not what, which was being operated at a US Air Force base in Florida. So I've got enough data points to tell me that what people like Dr. Gregory Rogers are saying is accurate. And I do think that we need to start taking these allegations seriously. The possibility that the United States is operating ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles. I cite also the Mike Herrera story, where Michael Herrera, a young US Marine, was on a patrol in Indonesia during a civilian crisis and evacuation during a disaster, and he came across a craft hovering in a clearing that was clearly being protected, guarded by paramilitary US accented military personnel. They weren't very friendly to him either. So why do I take Dr. Gregory Rogers seriously? Because there is a plethora of information to suggest that there's something to this. At some stage I'd love to get Dr. Rogers onto Reality Check. I guess what I'd like to do is take the story further. We try on the program to report what's being reported, and I do think it's important to acknowledge good men like Dr. Rogers who've come forward and given their evidence. But when they've been, as he has actually been fairly widely interviewed across a whole breadth of different podcasts and shows. I'd like to try and find a new angle, and we always try and find a new way into the story. And I've got one in mind, and at some stage I might bring him on.
Okay, we will go next to an email from Giuseppe. Hello, thank you for your hard work on the UFO subject. Have you tried CE5 contact yourself? If so, how many times, and have you gotten any results? I was able to get results by myself after a few failed attempts, but after that, it became quite easy. And common. I would recommend Greer's CE5 protocol, which is quite simple and easy to learn.
Okay, CE5, for those of us who don't know, is Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, where purportedly, using meditative, telepathic, psychical techniques, one is able to get oneself into a position where you can invite, perhaps summon, a non-human intelligence or craft or orb or whatever it is to come into your view. And have I done it? I've certainly tried it. I haven't done it successfully. In fact, I've been a miserable failure. But I certainly have witnessed it. I've witnessed it now twice. I saw it only about probably 7 or 8 weeks ago in northern Victoria at a place called Rutherglen, in a place called Jaya Sanctuary, run by an Australian called Peter Maxwell Slattery. And it's quite funny, actually. Peter said to me during the daytime, he said, I've got a feeling we're going to see stuff tonight. And we were standing in darkness, looking out probably to the west from his beautiful property. And as we were standing there, he was meditating and inviting them to come. And he's done a lot of work like this at Mount Shasta in California. And I was skeptical, to be perfectly honest, and maybe my skepticism's part of the problem. But as I watched, there were clearly dots that became orbs that moved closer and closer towards us, in some cases hovered just behind trees, probably no more than a few hundred feet in front of us. And I can't explain it. They were moving erratically. They weren't satellites, they weren't planes, they weren't drones, they weren't fireflies, they weren't birds. They were some kind of object that appeared to respond intelligently to Peter's invitations for them to come closer. And on a couple of occasions when he invited them to pulse up, that was the kicker for me, they literally flashed. I can't explain it. And I've seen the same thing before. I think I've talked about this before at Esalen, which is just down the coast from San Francisco, a beautiful place. If you ever get the opportunity to visit, it's a serene location sitting on the Pacific Ocean, high above the Pacific Ocean, run by a lot of beautiful people who spend their days meditating and thinking about spiritual things. It was a privilege to be invited there. And I was there with one of the psionics who's been now involved with Skywatcher. And he actually said to me at 4:00 in the afternoon, while it was still daytime, he said, Ross, we're going to see a blue orb tonight. And he even predicted it might be hexagonal or octagonal. I think he said hexagonal. Anyway, literally later on that night, we did. We saw a blue orb. Hundreds of people saw a blue orb hovering near a swimming pool where a lot of people were swimming naked. And it was right adjacent to the Pacific Ocean. And as people watched, it sank down onto the beach. And you could clearly see the blue phosphorescent hexagonal-shaped orb sitting on the beach. I can't explain it, but whatever it was, the person who summoned it told me that we were going to see it, and we did.
Okay, Russ, we will go to an email from David. Ross, could the secrecy surrounding this phenomenon be associated with the potential manipulation of human DNA? If non-human entities walk among us and have altered our genetic makeup, it raises the question of whether certain human populations might possess a higher proportion of non-human DNA than others. If this were the case, disclosure of such information could risk fueling eugenic ideologies or race-based conflict, potentially dividing humanity rather than uniting it. What do you think?
Okay. There is no hard scientific evidence, I'm told, to support the idea that there has been manipulation of the human genome. And it's interesting because I've read scientific papers that make this assertion, some of which I think might have been peer-reviewed. I mean, there was a couple of years ago, I got very excited because there was one paper that was published in Eastern Europe which suggested that there were DNA strands in the human genome that appeared to show some kind of manipulation. And I asked Professor Gary Nolan about this, and he poo-pooed it and said he didn't think there was much to it. So officially, at least, science says that there is no evidence of manipulation, any artificial manipulation of the human genome. But as many who follow the UAP subject will know, it's a long-known allegation that NHI, whatever they are, beings from other areas have been manipulating the human genome and possibly hybridizing humans with alien DNA. I've never been able to see any evidence to support this. There's a friend of mine here in Australia called Bill Chalker, who's a reputable scientist who's done some great work in a book called The Hair of the Alien. And he interviewed a gentleman called Curry, who claimed to have actually been forcibly made to have sex with two Nordic women who turned up in his bedroom. And the interesting thing about this incredible story is that they found a hair from one of these alleged beings, which when tested showed all manner of extraordinarily weird DNA. Whatever it wasn't entirely normal human DNA. There's been an interview done by a friend of mine called Rhys Dalton Morgan, which basically tells this whole story, and you can go on and have a look at that. Rhys Dalton Moore. As for the claims of ancient genetic engineering, yes, okay, there are claims, the ancient astronauts theory, that posit that extraterrestrials, the Anunnaki from Sumerian days, genetically altered early hominids like Homo erectus to create Homo sapiens as a labour force. And this has been popularised in different shows and books, but essentially there's not a lot of evidence to support it. How do you prove something like this? You know, there's obviously claims that have been made by witnesses about such types of genetic manipulation, but really, I did some reading about this recently. There was a preprint by a molecular biologist called Max Myakashev-Rempel, and he analysed 581 family DNA trios from the 1000 Genomes Project, and he alleged that approximately 2% showed non-parental insertions, large haplotype swaps on chromosome 3, which were inexplicable by natural means or inexplicable by pre-1990 human tech such as CRISPR, which does allow gene manipulation. And he made the assertion that this linked to alien manipulation, including pilot data from self-reported abductee families. Now, his claims have also been attacked and debunked and scepticised, so frankly, I don't know what to think. If anyone has any hard evidence of alien hybridisation, I'm your man. Send it my way.
Ross, naked people swimming in pools and group Nordic sex. This episode's getting kind of crazy.
It sounds like fun, doesn't it?
Yeah, I thought this was a family show, but can't wait to see the comments on this one. Thanks a lot. Here comes Tim in our email. Dear Ross, thanks for your work. Have you investigated the Dawdleston case, aka the vertical plane case? Best wishes, Tim.
The vertical plane case. It does sound like a UAP craft, but the Dawdleston messages were these weird messages that somebody apparently had a very early home computer in an old farmhouse in the United Kingdom, and they left it on at night, and apparently they'd been having all manner of weird poltergeist-like phenomena. They'd found footprints, six-toed footprints in the corners of the house in the dust, and there was all manner of weird paranormal telekinesis type phenomena that they couldn't explain. And apparently, this is the implausible part of this. Why would a guy from Elizabethan England know how to operate a home computer? That was always when I read this book, The Vertical Plane, it talked about how they found messages on their home computer in these Dawdleston messages, which were a person writing in Elizabethan English prose. And apparently it was like there were linguists who are familiar with oldie Elizabethan English, and it was absolutely spot on accurate to the way that people spoke at that time. And whoever it was had typed on the computer a message angrily declaiming them for taking over his home. And the claim was made, or the suspicion was, that it was some kind of interdimensional portal where he was somehow able, from 15th century England, able to tap on a computer keyboard in 20th century England and leave messages for the young couple. Now, I guess I'm thinking about how a caveman would feel if he saw a computer keyboard or a mobile phone. How on earth would somebody from Elizabethan England know how to operate a computer and tap a message out? That was always my problem with the Dawdleston messages. I did read the book, The Vertical Plane. I commend it to people because it certainly baffled a lot of investigators from British UFO groups that went and investigated, because apparently some of this phenomena manifested when they were there and they saw some of this happening. So a lot of people vouched for the integrity of the couple that owned the house. And I'd actually love to know. I don't know whether it's still happening, but certainly it was a very interesting British paranormal story, wonderful ghost story, whether it's true or not, where essentially some dude from Elizabethan England starts leaving messages on an old home computer. And as far as I know, it was never disproven, but it was never proven either.
Okay, we have Carolyn, who lives in London, reaching out to us on email. Dear Ross, firstly, thank you for all the time and effort you invest in trying to clarify and expose information which is legitimately belongs to humanity per se. I was fascinated by your interview with Jake Barber. He is both courageous and selfless. I understand and endorse his efforts to control the narrative somewhat because I trust him to be rigorous and exercise moral responsibility with the matter of disclosure. I am equally impressed with the journey Brandon Fugel has both enabled and undergone, and would thank him. His unnerving and dogged determination is inspiring and is unfortunately what it's going to take. Thank you for your recent interview with him. My question is as follows. It has been evident since the first TV series filmed at Skinwalker Ranch that the phenomena is aware of the intention of investigators. Jake's initiative is enabled by the use of psionics, the deliberate use of intentional thought. In your opinion, would it be productive for Travis and Jake to cooperate by creating a joint but discrete supplementary investigation to help clarify how the physical manifestation is related to the forces of intention and telepathy?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So basically, the idea of getting collaboration between Travis Taylor from Skinwalker Ranch and Jake Barber, who's taken interest in psionics. I can tell you, I don't think I'm giving anything away here. I can tell you that there is going to be a video coming out, I hope relatively soon, from our friends at Skywatcher. That's the Jake Barber, Alex Clokus privately funded group that are investigating UAP phenomena and trying to use psionic summoning and the dog whistle to bring UAP objects, craft close in so that they can be videoed, photographed and studied. They are doing a study on psionics. They've spoken publicly about this in their previous videos. I think they've done interviews where they've talked about the fact that they are going to be studying telepathy and psionics. And I'm really excited. I'm aware of some of the work that they've been doing, and I'm really excited. I'm told they are in the peer review process at the moment, and it's taking a lot longer than expected. I am assured there is no cover-up underway, that they are going to be fully open and transparent, and I'm looking forward at some stage to interviewing either Alex or Jake or somebody from Skywatcher about it. But they are tied up in a very rigorous peer review process that is part of their own internal vetting and checking procedures. But at some stage, very, very soon, quite exciting work that I'm aware of that they've been doing with telepathy will be being made public. Watch this space.
All right, Ross, this viewer is coming from Bali, Indonesia. His name is Steve. Hi, Ross and Megan. Thanks for that great interview with Michael Herrera a while ago. Would you consider interviewing ufologist Timothy Alberino, who investigated similar suspicious black ops militia abducting humans with alien tech down in Peru? Are you familiar with this case? Keep up the good work.
Actually, I have exchanged messages with Tim Alberino, and he is on my list. As we all say, too much reality check is barely enough, and frankly, I just can't keep up with the volume of people that are available to be interviewed and the breadth and magnitude of the stories that we're trying to cover here. It's really exciting, actually. I'm very much enjoying. I thought where I'm living at the moment, I'd be moving into a quiet, gentle, peaceful retirement in the Southern Highlands south of Sydney, maybe doing the odd UFO book and maybe doing the odd interview. It's just unbelievable, the volume of messages and responses that we're getting from people. It's very, very gratifying. And Tim's one of them. He did some great work. I've watched a few of his shows where he actually went down and investigated claims, particularly claims about the abduction or the attempted abduction of, I think, a 15-year-old teenage girl from a tribal community in Brazil, Peru, can't remember which place it was, but she told this harrowing story of this being on some kind of levitating platform coming towards her up a slope, grabbing her and trying to abduct her. Quite a frightening story. And if you take this into the context of the Chubba Chubbas, which we've also spoken about with Ronnie Vernay, a Brazilian friend, we know that there are claims in tribal communities in both Brazil and Peru of often unfriendly beings, often using highly advanced technology that try and abduct locals, particularly young women. So yeah, Tim Alberino has investigated that, and thank you for reminding me. We should get Tim on. That's a great idea. I'm also in touch with Ronnie Vernay, who's doing another trip very soon to northern Brazil, and we're hoping to bring you a story on that at some stage as well.
Okay. Hi, Ross and Megan. Great show. I never miss it, and keep up the great work. Question. I know from listening to your recent podcast with guest Dr. Anna Brady Estevez, a scientist, a founding member of a deep tech investment firm, someone who has held directorial positions on many boards that promote learning and investment in science, tech, energy, digital resources, an extremely credible and well-informed individual. The doctor has publicly spoken and confirmed the U.S. and world government's awareness of UAP and that commercial partners are taking the significance and potential of this extremely seriously. This once not so open secret is now not a secret to well-informed business entities. How and when is the knowledge of this going to be broadcast to the general public? Front page stuff, I would have thought. Will we now see capitalist greed overcome humanities right now? Kind regards, Matt.
Well, sometimes capitalist greed does really clever things, and frankly, free enterprise is one of the ways that we've been able to develop technologies. And I just want to applaud Anna Brady Estevez for speaking as frankly as she did to us the other day with Sarah Gam about what she saw over the Congress. We had her on to talk about the weird objects that they saw hovering over the Congress the night prior to the UAP hearing before Congress. They didn't quite land on the White House lawn, but they certainly made themselves known. And more prominently, Anna Brady Estevez, who's an extremely reputable scientist and very, very well connected in space tech, has spoken out quite prominently on the issue of UAPs. She gave a May this year, May 2025 UAP experts panel briefing to Congress, and she described how she co-chaired an interagency working group that included leaders from the NASA, Space Force, the Department of Energy, Department of Health, Human Services. And indeed, there's a podcast, a NASA-sponsored podcast that she was involved in that we spoke about in this program. And I asked her about it, which was just incredible because she had a guy called Richard Bandurek who talked about working with UAP technology. And all credit to Anna, she makes no secret of the fact that she thinks that there is retrieved technology and that everybody knows it and everybody's talking about it. And in her briefing to Congress, she noted that this interagency group that she was part of facilitated UAP leading content discussions, including indications that there was high government awareness and coordination on UAP data and science. She talked about declassification efforts and said that previously classified or unclassified UAP-related work has led to open expert presentations, such as inviting specialists to share extended electrodynamics or dedicated UAP presentations. And perhaps Richard Bandurek's presentation that he gave to her podcast was one of them. So this is suggesting that maybe what's happening is that maybe government secrets are slowly being allowed to be revealed through industry discussions such as what she's having. And in the same congressional briefing that she gave in May this year, she actually addressed crash retrievals, UAP crash retrievals, directly. She said, are there crash retrievals? Well, are there crashes? I mean, there's where I live. I mean, a crash seems a lot more interesting than a deer to pick up. And anybody who knows an engineer says the first time you see anything of interest, you're certainly going to reverse engineer it. And I guess this was a very coy way of saying that government and private entities inevitably are going to try and reverse engineer anything that they can retrieve, they would naturally pursue recovery and analysis of UAP crashes. And then she further elaborated. She said, do we just not do certain layering or advancement of certain materials because they've been found in crash retrievals? And that appeared again to coyly suggest that there were UAP-derived materials that were influencing US scientific and engineering advancements. And so I think Dr. Brady Estevez has been quite prominent in sticking her head up, indicating very, very strongly that there is retrieved technology. And on the show, the Good Trouble show recently, my friend Matt Ford, she actually talked about credible sources and high-performing technologies that have emerged from UAP crash retrievals. And she talked about a former CIA director's secret ties to UFOs, UAPs, and extraterrestrials. And she emphasised how such programs have accelerated innovations in lasers, semiconductors, and energy systems. She was pretty damn clear that she thinks that UAP tech has influenced what we've developed. And she also described widespread sightings of ultra-advanced craft that are higher performing, that have been captured on various sensors by innovators in aerospace and energy fields. And she noted that for people that are building the highest performing craft and the highest performing energy, they're not trying to unsee what they've seen. So she implied very, very strongly that these observations do challenge human technological limits and point to non-human origins. And in the congressional briefing, she revealed that 30 to 50% of innovators in closed rooms share personal UAP experiences. And she framed this as a common phenomenon among scientists rather than a fringe belief. She positioned UAPs as an engineering data analysis problem, not folklore. And she talked about funded private companies developing UAP-inspired or UAP-adjacent technologies during her National Science Foundation tenure. She was actually on the board of the National Science Foundation. So she's advocated for US national preparedness and stigma-free research, and she told the podcasts that she's spoken to that transparency is essential as, quote, secret UFO, UAP science and technologies are already changing everything through government and entrepreneurial channels. Overall, she basically made it very, very clear that the US government and private aerospace are up to their necks in UAP technologies. They're just not telling us about it. And I think it's incredibly significant that somebody of the stature and high reputation of Dr. Anna Brady Estevez is willing to speak publicly about this and know that she's not going to suffer stigma, ridicule or denigration or threats as a result of her speaking out. And maybe that's where disclosure is going to come from, because I'm sorry, I don't think it's going to come anytime soon from government. It might come from the CIA. I notice, and I keep on hoping that people like John Brennan, I heard a whisper that the Age of Disclosure documentary is going to be coming out soon, possibly on a limited cinema release and more broadly possibly on Prime Amazon. But on that, John Brennan, the former CIA director from 2013 to 2017 under Obama, he was very vocal on UAPs. He's in a 2020 interview, he described Pentagon-released UFO videos as quite eyebrow-raising, emphasising that while he doesn't know their origins, they warrant serious investigation beyond conventional explanations like foreign adversaries. And he suggested the phenomena might represent a different form of life, leaving open the possibility that it's extraterrestrial. And I understand he's gone a lot further in what he said in Age of Disclosure. And John Ratcliffe, who's the current CIA director, he's worth mentioning, actually. I've made a few notes of what John Ratcliffe has said. He was nominated as the CIA director in late 2024, confirmed by the Senate this year. And in public appearances, John Ratcliffe, the CIA director, has asserted that UAPs demonstrate, quote, technologies that we don't have and frankly that we can't defend against. They've been tracked by multiple sensors, including satellites, and he's ruled out the explanation that they might be illusions or drones. He criticised the Biden administration for withholding information, claiming, quote, "The government has more information than it's sharing." And he promised more revelations once declassified. And during his DNI tenure, when he was the Director of National Intelligence, Ratcliffe pushed for declassification, noting that there'd been sightings all over the world with no clear explanation. And he's vowed to be more open. So fingers crossed from Tulsi Gabbard in DNI and John Ratcliffe in CIA, we might see a move for greater disclosure, because it's sure as hell not going to come from Congress by the looks of it.
Okay, Russ, we have time for one more. Adrian reached out to me on X and he says, ask Ross if I can take him for a beer next time he's in Melbourne. I promise I won't ask him anything about UAPs.
Oh, bollocks. Of course you'd ask me about UAPs. I'd love to talk about UAPs. You don't have to buy me a beer, but I'm very happy to have a beer with you. One of the gratifying things about doing this story is when I was on 60 Minutes, quite often people would walk up to me in airports and abuse me about my latest story. They'd say, "You mongrel, you got no idea what you're talking about. You got it all wrong." And the lovely thing about doing this story is the level of positive public feedback that I get frequently. It's actually quite weird. I've walked through any airport or public space. I'm generally stopped by someone saying how much they love the show, how much they appreciate it. When I was in the United States in May, every single airport that I went through, I was stopped by people multiple times and told how much they appreciated the show. And can I tell you, it's very gratifying. I love it. I really enjoy the fact that you like the show. We're very gratified that we're in the top 50 podcasts for the United States. You like what we're doing, and we're going to keep on doing it for you. And just echoing what I said in last week's show about the level of unpopularity of mainstream media, I think 28% of people trust the media, which is a ridiculously low number. I think the figure was 8% of Republicans trust the mainstream media. I like to think that people trust us on Reality Check because we do try and talk warts and all about the UAP issue and all the other subjects that are so taboo the mainstream media won't touch it with a barge pole. So please keep on listening to us, and thank you very, very much for your gratifying response. And yes, mate, next time I'm in Melbourne, let's have that beer.
Okay, Ross, that is all for today. We are done.
Thank you very, very much, Megan. And of course, if you want to send us questions, you can send me an email at realitycheck@newsnationnow.com. And please don't forget, too much Reality Check is barely enough. You can now listen again to Reality Check on all of the known podcast sites, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all the others. You can just put Reality Check, Ross Coulthart, News Nation into the search engine and you will find us there. You can listen to us while you drive, while you shower, while you lie in bed, because too much Reality Check is barely enough. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Megan.